I wanted to make a video about MBTI, which stands for Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, because I think it can be an interesting and useful tool for spiritual growth. Now, if you aren't already familiar with some of the basics of MBTI, this video might not be as useful for you. I will kind of recap some of the basics, but I'm not going to go in depth explaining the origins of MBTI or what the basic letters and functions mean and things like that. So this is a little bit more of a intermediate to advanced MBTI video, and I'm really putting it out there because I use MBTI personally, but I don't use it in the traditional way. And I thought that some of the people who might be interested in my other videos could also be interested in MBTI. So I wanted to kind of bridge the gap and say, hey, if you're interested in both of these topics, my model and theory and MBTI, then you might find this video helpful. But if you don't know anything about MBTI, don't feel bad. Feel free to watch this video anyways. And if some of it doesn't make sense to you, then feel free to do some research on MBTI and come back and watch it again later, or just do your best to follow along. So with that being said, I want to cover some notes here. MBTI is more of a spiritual model than scientific. This is my opinion. I know that a lot of people who believe in MBTI swear by it, and I think that it is a useful and interesting tool. But I think it's useful and interesting in the same way that archetypes and dream interpretation and astrology or tarot can be. They're not scientific in the sense that the way that they're being used can be backed up by testing. That's not to say that there's no data backing up MBTI, but generally speaking, something like Ocean within the psychiatric and psychological communities, I believe is generally considered to be more scientific. And what I mean by that is it's easier to use it in a sort of corporate-like environment, but that's not how we're using it here, right? This is a spiritual channel, and we're using it for spiritual purposes. That's how I use it personally, at least. So if you're someone who believes that MBTI is a, purely factual scientific method, I'm not here to argue with you, but that's not the opinion I hold. So I think that it's okay to not be a completely scientific model. I use the comparison of astrology and tarot, but I think that MBTI is much more useful in general than those two, or at least more, I should say, strategically rational than those two, because the archetypes or the symbolic concepts that MBTI uses, like these functions and these type indicators, they're based on more rational data, right? So a lot of psychological thought has gone into, and a lot of surveying and testing has gone into creating this model. It is in my opinion, more spiritual model, but because it's backed by more evidence and more rational surveying and things like that, better data than something like, say, for example, astrology or tarot, it can be more precise. And that's not to say that it's perfect, but I do think that it is a step above those. So when people compare it to astrology, I always cringe a little bit because I think that while astrology can be useful, it's kind of to me, I think that it can be a little bit outdated in the sense that that's not really how the stars work, in my opinion. Based on what we know in science, like the constellations and things like that don't exactly work the way that we thought they worked, way back when. So even though they can be vague indicators of, how something might have worked, and I think that they can be useful symbols for concepts like cycles and personality archetypes and things like that, I think that they're a little bit too loose. And so when people take astrology a little bit too seriously, I think that can be a little bit dangerous. I'm not someone who would ever think that astrology is a good way to, for example, predict the future. I don't think that astrology has that kind of magical power, but what I think it can do, and if you go back to my original video about my spiritual journey, I talk in that about how I think that a lot of magic and the occult and what it's trying to do is essentially psychological, trying to understand the internal world, the self, the personal, subjective being. And I think that that's also what astrology and tarot and MBTI can be good for, is if you think about what things like archetypes are, they're basically story tropes, right? Like they're narrative recurrences or patterns. And so if you think about it, being human beings, we're all going to have these patterns recurring inside of our minds and personalities. And I think that something like MBTI does a much better job, in my opinion, of capturing it than something like tarot or astrology. But I think they're all essentially trying to do the same thing, which is to say that they're all trying to capture the patterns that are recurring within human and animal personalities, and even nature to a degree. And apply those in a way that is a little bit more rational, trying to pin it down and say, well, what really are these archetypes? What are these patterns? Where do they emerge from? Why are they useful? Why do they keep repeating? Kind of like the hero's journey is an example of that, right? So without digressing too much, let's get into the rest of the notes. This is not a standard view of MBTI. This is just my version of MBTI. And I still prefer MBTI to Ocean because, again, Ocean is more for, in my opinion, like a more of a clinical and corporate world. And that's not what I do. I'm not interested in that personally. I'm more interested in like artistic, spiritual version of self-exploration. So what is MBTI? So this is where I'll kind of give you the rundown of the basics, which you should already basically know. MBTI is pretty much broken down into these letters, right? Extroverted, introverted, intuitive sensory, thinking, feeling, and judging and perceiving. And then if you go deeper into it, which I'm guessing if you're still watching this video, most of you have gone a little bit deeper into it, into the functions. So the functions are kind of what's behind these letters and how they interact with each other, and really how they're called cognitive processing functions. And so this is extroverted sensing, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, introverted intuition, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, and introverted feeling. So now that we kind of have this basic set of like almost chess pieces, right? Like colors that we're painting with or musical notes that we're playing with. Why? Where does all this come from? And I think that within the MBTI community, this isn't an answer or a question that's been answered particularly well, in my opinion. So I'd like to attempt to give you some basis for the answer now, or at least how I perceive it. So, for example, why are extroverts extroverted? And why are extroverts extroverted in different ways? So if we think about, for example, like an ENFJ versus an ENTP, right? These are very different forms of extroversion, right? The ENFJ might be the person at the party talking to everybody, talking to them about their feelings, concerned about who they are, and trying to get to know them and sharing their own thoughts and feelings with a high level of vulnerability, right? Whereas the ENTP or an ENTJ or an ESTP, right? These types are much more rational. They're approaching things a different way. They're interested in different things. They might be more focused on projects than they are on people, right? So why is it that we have this big difference between types of extroversion, and what makes somebody extroverted? Is it just because they answered, yes, I'm extroverted on the quiz, or is there something more in depth to what extroversion really means within this model? And I'll be talking about this diagram much, much more later, but basically my concept of extrovert versus introvert is that an extrovert is essentially their attention is on the extroverted world, the external world. Okay, so I have a very different model of what it means to be extroverted, and I hope that whoever you are, extrovert or introvert, that some of this will really ring true for you as I'm describing it, because I think that it's a better model than the concept of, are you social or non-social? I think that's such a silly way, because everyone is social at times and everyone is non-social at times. Even the most extroverted person in the world gets burned out socializing and wants to go home, or, you know, they don't want people around them all the time, right? There are certain things we like to do in private, whether it's meditation or eating, or it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, there's a time and a season for everything, right? So I don't think it works to simply say that extroverts love people and introverts don't love people so much. There are definitely introverts who really, really do love people. So if I'm not talking about extrovert and introvert being social or non-social or antisocial or asocial, what do I think it is? Well, to me, it's the idea of the extroverted versus the introverted world. And so if you think about it, if you think of yourself, the introverted world is going to be your mind, right? Inside your internal world. And the extroverted world is going to be the actual world that we share together. The extroverted world in the sense of like where everything else is that's not inside your head, right? So if you think of, for example, art, okay? If you think of art, there's the actual painting on the wall, and then there's your perception of the painting inside yourself. Okay, so this is an example of the separation between the inside and the outside world. And you can also perhaps start to see how some of this relates back to my own spiritual model from my previous videos, the Rational Hope model. So why are P's, for example, stereotypically messy and J's are neat? This is another thing that's not usually explained particularly well. Well, one of the things is when you get into the letters, like let's use, for example, ENTJ, how you get the functions from the letters, there's kind of a formula for this, right? And the first place you start is with this letter at the end, the J or the P. If it is a J, then you're extroverting the judging function, which is always going to be in this third slot. So if you have a J at the end, that means that the judging is extroverted. Okay, so you're going to extrovert the judging, which in this case is T. So you know that you have TE. All right, and then that means that the other function is going to be introverted. So you're going to have NI and ENTJ. And then in order to determine which one is going to be at the front, so these are your top two, right? That's what NT means, that your top two are going to be N and T. And from the J, it determines which one is introverted and which one is extroverted, okay? This is very different from how a lot of other people think about MBTI, even though this is still within the basic model. And then when we get to the E, this determines which one comes first, right? Are you focused on the external world or the internal world? So you can start to see where I get this concept from. It's already built into the model. So in the case of an ENTJ, because they're an E, the extrovert is going to come first. But if they were, for example, an INTJ, they'd have the same top two functions, but because they're an I instead of an E, it's the NI that's going to come first. So for example, an ENTJ, the top functions are going to be TE, NI, SE, and then FI. Whereas for the INTJ, it's going to be NI, TE, and then FI, and then SE. So they have the same functions, but they're in a different order. And so it's really important where that order is derived from. You can't just think of it as, okay, so I've got these four or these eight functions, if you go into the shadow functions. I've got these four functions, but where do they come from? Why are those my four functions, right? We have to ask the question why if we really want to understand ourselves and the model that we're basing some of our exploration of our identity on. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit more of my model and how it relates to all of this. Okay, so hopefully I've answered these two questions for you. So my model is based on this diagram, and I kind of took the basic model of MBTI and how the formula for how we determine what your four letters are and then what your functions are in what order, and I put them on this kind of it's kind of a cycle, right? And it starts with SE. Doesn't matter what your functions are, it always starts with SE. So I'm not talking about the order of your functions, I'm talking about the order of life, the order that life happens in, okay? So how does life happen? Well, we start with external stimuli, right? So where does external stimuli come from? The external sensory environment. That's what SE is. So if we're thinking about that person, right? If we're thinking about that person having an experience, they kind of look a little bit twisted with one eye smaller than the other. There we go. They look like they were having a stroke or something. The external experience has to enter your mind before you can have an internal experience, right? If there's no external experience at all, then we're not going to have the internal experience, right? So where does the external experience come from? It comes from the external world, SE. So the SE, the external sensing, is what feeds information into us. Well, how does it do that? Well, you'll notice there's a rotating pattern here of the perceiving functions and the judging functions. So the perceiving functions are in this blue color, and then the judging functions are in this, oh God, what would that color be? I'm not even gonna guess right now. Magenta, maybe? I'm flying with magenta. Okay, so SE goes into FI. So why? I wanna always answer the question why. It's really important to ask this like a little child. So why does FI come from SE? Well, because if you think of like a stamp, right? When we have the external pressing on the internal, it leaves an internal impression, right? So if we have a stamp that's a smiley face, right? I don't know how this would look, but that's the stamp handle and this is the smiley face, okay? So when we stamp that onto our internal, whether it's like a metal stamp or an ink stamp, doesn't really matter. The point is that it leaves an impression. Okay, so now when we take the external stimuli away, right, when we take this away, we leave that environment, we leave that stimuli, it's no longer interacting with us, we're still left with this internal impression. And that's what FI is. That's what internal feeling is. Think about it. Internal feeling is the process of translating the external sensory to the internal sensory, okay? So the stamp itself is the internal sensory, and the process of interpreting the external into the internal from external stimuli into internal stimuli or internal sensory is Fi. So what we end up with is the stamp itself is Si, and the external stamp, or sorry, the stamp, the impression that the stamp leaves is Si. The external stamp is Se, okay? So the reason that it leaves the impression that it does is based on Fi. So in other words, what we're saying, or what I'm saying, is that if you think of having an experience, so think of, for example, listening to a song, okay? So we've got music as the external stimuli, okay? So this is coming from the external sensory world outside of us. Then it travels toward our internal self, our internal impression of that music. So it travels toward our mind, okay, and how we're going to interpret it. So what is the lens that we interpret it through? How do we judge it? Okay, we're judging it, we perceive it from the external world, then we judge it through Fi. And what that essentially means is our internal infrastructure, who we are, our identity, is essentially being applied to this. So if you think of the cup, right, if you watch my previous videos and think of the cup is essentially one version of Fi where it's shaping everything that comes into it. Okay, so the SE, you can think of the SE stimuli as the water being poured into the cup, and the Fi is judging it, saying, how do I perceive this function? Well, how am I judging the perception? So how does it relate to me? That's what Fi is. How does this stimuli relate to me? What is my personal experience of it? So how did you experience this music? Did you find the music beautiful? Did you find it ugly? Did it make you feel happy? Did it make you feel sad? Okay, that's Fi. And then what Fi spits out, the actual conclusion of that process of judging, is the SI impression. So you can think of this SI impression as kind of the memory that the Fi experience creates. So you have an SE, external stimuli, which gets processed through the Fi judgment, which is sort of like the interaction between the external stimuli and your internal identity. And then the mixture of those two spits out SI, which is essentially the result of those two mixing, right? So we can think of it as the addition. And then the equal sign over here creates the SI. So now that we have SI, what do we do with SI? Well, we go from SI, so now we have this internal impression like a memory or like a stamp on our mind, and we have to know where to sort that. What do we do with this, okay? How does it fit into our puzzle of all the other SIs that we have, okay? So you think of SE being this external stimuli that goes through the Fi sort of lens, let's draw the lens like that, the SI sort of lens, and creates this sort of collection of SI bits or data, right? So this is a data set, and this is a data set, okay? This is the data set of what was outside of you, and then you translate that through Fi into, this is now what's inside of you, how you experienced it. So now we've got all these little SIs, right? Think of it like a big floating scattered pattern of SIs. What do we do with all this information? Well, this is where TI comes in, okay? TI is internal thinking. It's the arrangement or the organization of all of the SI, the internal sensory impressions, the memories, the data set, the internal information into NI, okay, which is a new data set, which is to say, what is the relationship between all of these SI pieces, the SI puzzle pieces, and how do they fit in, right? How do they fit into a bigger picture? What does it all mean is essentially what NI is saying. So we're using TI to put together an NI puzzle to say, what do I think the bigger picture of this really is? Okay, and then from NI, we're coming back around, and through FE, this is the one that trips a lot of people up in my model, because they say, well, wait, how does FE have anything to do with NE and NI? Well, let me tell you. So once we have this internal model, we're really asking ourselves the next question of, how do I take my model and express it back out into the world? Okay, so how do I take this internal version of myself, my model of myself, the world, of others, this sort of metaphysical concept, right? The metaphysical puzzle that we've solved using TI, putting together all the little SI puzzle pieces that we got from this experience over here. And so we ask ourselves, how do I put this back out into the world? So now we're coming full circle, right? We've gone from the external world to the internal world. Now we're going back to the external world. This is going to be important later. So NI to FE is asking, what do I do with myself? How do I express myself and share myself? How do I act on my vision? And that creates NE. So NE is another data set, which is to say, what is valuable and what am I doing with it? What is possible from this model? So if we think of NI as sort of like a picture, right? Then NE is sort of writing the story of what are the different alternative stories that I can create with this picture, right? You ever done that? Like it's sort of like the caption game. Like if you have a picture, which NI is your picture of conceptual reality, right? SE is actual reality. NI is conceptual reality. So NE is asking, okay, I have this conceptual reality and I want to express it in a way that's valuable and meaningful to me. How do I do that? And then you create these storylines like, okay, what would be if I did this, if I acted in this way, what might that result in? Okay? So it's kind of grading based on FE. It's grading what's valuable to you, right? It's grading what alternatives could exist in terms of how I would express my internal NI concept of myself and reality and everybody else. So how are we going to take the puzzle from the inside and put it outside of ourselves? That's what NE is all the possibilities that we're considering. And then once we have NE and we pick an option, right? Once we pick one of the NE alternatives, we say, okay, this is what I want to do. Now how do I do it? That's what TE is. TE is basically saying, I have this concept of myself and what I think is important and valuable, and I've determined which of these options I want to express, and I've narrowed that down to one option that I think is I'm going to express. So TE is basically asking the question, so how do I do that? How do I plan around this option that I've selected from the options available to get this back to SE? So now we've come full circle. So you see how there's this kind of process, and every single one of us is going through this full process at all times. This wheel is constantly turning inside of all of us at all times. Okay? So being, let's say, TE versus FE is a completely different version of being an extrovert. Being NE versus SE is a completely different version of being an extrovert, okay? So we talked about, for example, why are P's stereotypically messy? I actually forgot to answer that question. I apologize. I get distracted sometimes. Why are P's stereotypically messy and why are J's stereotypically neat? Well, let's use our model here, right? So how do we determine if you are what you are if you're a P or a J? Well, we talked about if you're an ENTJ, for example, what are your top two functions going to be? It's going to be TE first and then NI second. Well, which one was determined by J? This one. We extroverted our thinking function, our judging function, because J was our fourth letter. Okay, so if we were ESTP, our P says that we extrovert the S. Okay, so guess what? That means that if you are an if you are a J, you can only ever be, actually, let me erase this. If you're a J, you can only ever be NI and SI. And if you're a P, you can only ever be NE or SE in your top two functions. So what do we notice if you're familiar with MBTI and you're not just waiting for me to tell you? What do we immediately notice about this? Well, these are very, very organized functions that are all based on internal, right? So all of these functions, SI and NI, are things working toward organization, organizing things into an internal conceptual model of reality. Whereas P leads to NE and SE. These are both on the extroverted side, which are moving toward actual action in reality. So what are P's going to be? They're going to be action oriented, right? They're going to want to do things in reality. And J's are, what are they going to be? They're going to be concept oriented. Ooh, concept. Yeah, I know how to spell things, don't worry. So they're going to be concept oriented, right? So they're going to want to organize. So why are P's stereotypically messy? Because they just want to act. They don't want to take the time to conceptualize and organize. All right. And why do they just want to act? Because they're trying to get things to happen in the real world. So if you look at any of them, ENFP, any of them, ENTP, doesn't matter. They're all going to have that same sort of feel to them, and it doesn't just come from randomness. It's not just a stereotype. It's stereotypical as a result of the fact that if you look at these, the basic formula for how you get their type, it comes from the J and the P dictating which of these two is extroverted, right? So they're going to have a specific personality type that's going to be more organized or more action-oriented based on how it relates to this sort of circular model, this sort of circular cycle of what our mind is doing and how these functions all relate to each other. So if you don't understand this model, which, I believe this is original to me, I don't know if it is or not, but if you don't understand this diagram, then you're not going to understand why things like this happen within MBTI, because you're kind of looking at it at the surface level and just saying, okay, we have these functions, let's understand the functions. Yeah, but why do you have those functions, right? Look at the formula, and then how does that formula create this sort of diagram image or this picture or this cycle? Okay, so now let's go over here and look at or think about what do the order of functions mean, right? So now we understand this kind of concept of, okay, so all these functions, this wheel of functions is constantly turning, right? But then you ask, okay, but if the ENTJ, for example, is TENI, then those two things don't come in order on here, right? NI is right here and TE is all the way over here. So what the hell does that mean? How does that fit into this more common mainstream understanding of MBTI? Well, that's where the attention awareness gradient comes in, okay? What your order of functions means, let's finish this real quick. So SE, wow, look at that S. Okay, SE, and then this is going to be FI, okay? So one thing we have to notice here real quick is that every single person in their top 4 functions has to have one of each type of function, meaning that you have an introverted perception and an extroverted perception, and then you have an extroverted judging and an introverted judging, right? So you have to have one of each type, and that's important because of how they all work together, okay? Your brain, your mind, can only conceptualize this within consciousness if it has at least one of all 4 types to focus on. So now, how does this order relate to this order? Well, in my model, there's attention awareness gradient, which basically says that your top function is where the majority of your focus is centered on. So if we think of like our childhood, right? One of my theories about why we have the order of functions we have is how we survived in childhood. Everyone has a problem to solve, okay? How do we survive? How do we avoid the danger and the pain? And how do we seek the pleasure and the happiness? Everyone is doing that from the time they're born to the time they die. It's part of being an animal. It's in our DNA, okay? So I don't think that's very controversial. But everyone is born into a unique environment with a unique set of tools. Some of the tools are already pre-stored in your DNA. Okay, some people are going to be naturally better at using logic. Some people are going to be naturally more attuned to emotions, so on and so forth, based on their DNA. But on top of that, you have to solve a unique puzzle in your childhood. So within your childhood, people like your parents, okay, and your siblings, and your community, like your school and things like that, okay, all of this is your environment. And the environment can often be very hostile. And so you have to pay attention, just like an animal not wanting to be killed by a predator, right? You have to pay attention to what is important. What determines what is important to you? Well, it's what helps you seek pleasure. I'm not even going to try. And avoid pain, right? So if, say, for example, your parent is a very angry parent who says everything has to be done a very particular way, or my emotions are going to be out of control. Well, guess what? Your job then as a child is to figure out, to solve the puzzle, to solve the problem of how do I survive in this environment? How do I figure out how to not piss off this parent and upset their wild, crazy emotions? Okay? And in order to do that, depending on what does or does not upset their emotions, you might lean toward something like a thinking or an extroverted, right? So if, say, for example, if you grow up with somebody who's very internally unstable, And I'm not saying all parents have to be bad. There's always some kind of version of how to survive and thrive. Maybe you spend less time avoiding pain and more time seeking out more pleasure because you're already thriving in your wonderful hospital environment. I didn't grow up in that environment, but good for you if you did. So if your parent is, for example, internally unstable, then you might think about something more like NI or SI or FI or FE, right? Why? Because you have to figure out their emotions internally to them, and you have to do that as a sort of puzzle, right? Internally to you. So you might be TI as well. So I don't want to go too much into this, but the point I'm saying is that consciousness is attention, and attention can only be in one place at one time. So depending on the puzzle that you are trying to solve as a child, your attention gets more value, more return on investment if you invest it in a particular area. And where you, as a child, learn to invest your attention is going to determine where you are getting, where your focus is, or what function your focus is, what your first function is. Okay? So in other words, what is valuable to you as a child, or what you determine is valuable as a child, is where you pay attention, what you pay attention to, because we're all trying to get that reward and avoid that punishment. So now that we've kind of figured out why somebody might be one function versus another function as dominant, that dominant function in order is telling you from the first function, right? So if you're an INFJ, the first function is NI. So this is the center of your attention the majority of the time. So that's at the center of this circle, right? This is, if we think of shining the flashlight, right, which is a metaphor I've used before. If we think of the light of the flashlight as sort of our attention, what we're paying attention to, the flashlight is on NI for an INFJ. And so the brightest spot is at the center, which means that you're going to see the most information. This is going to be the clearest. It's going to make the most sense to you because you've specialized in this. That's how you survived, okay? You're the best at this. Then from there, the slightly dimmer but still bright ray of the flashlight is going to come out toward FE. Then from there, you're going to see still fairly bright, but a little bit dimmer, your TI. And again, this is all if you're INFJ. And then you're going to get to the point where you're really starting to get, it's very difficult to see it, but you can still kind of see like a peripheral vision sort of a thing. The motion, right? It's sort of vague and low image quality. I forgot the word for that. Anyways, I use it in another video. It doesn't matter. So you're gonna still be able to see this, but sort of only out of the corner of your eye, right? So you can see this sort of gradient of light from light to dark, and this is consciousness. So this is essentially unconscious. I'm not even gonna finish writing it. And this is the most conscious. Okay, and so basically what we're saying is that your top function is what you're most consciously aware of. It has the most light in your mind shown on it. And then it goes down from there until you get to SE, which is your fourth function is basically right in the border between your consciousness and your unconsciousness. So this is very foggy for you. And so if you think about why it's so damn difficult for you to use your fourth function, why some people call it the stress function, is because when you think about, like, okay, so imagine being outside at night, right? And you're trying to do something, and your friend, let's say, or you even, are shining a flashlight on what you're trying to do. Let's say that the flashlight starts to veer off, right? It starts to veer off toward the edge. Instead of being at the center of what you're doing, it's at the edge of what you're doing. And so we're trying to operate in a part of our mind that is normally subconscious to us. It's normally barely conscious. And so when we do this, it's not something we've specialized in particularly well. So as we're doing it, we're sort of like, we're operating at the edge of the flashlight. And if we do move our flashlight toward that, then we're getting less out of our investment, because this is not what we've been rewarded doing, right? This is not what we specialize in, because it's not what helped us survive the most. So we naturally want to come back to what has helped us the most and what we consider the most valuable function. So we don't want to spend time here. We can if we absolutely have to, but we want to come back to our primary function. So the reason the fourth function is stressful is because it's farther away from your conscious awareness. It's farther away from what you're used to and what makes sense to you. Okay? So all of this basically comes back to the idea that we want to use MBTI kind of like interpreting dreams, right? I'm not telling you that it is a limitation, right? It's not a box. Think of it kind of like a character sheet. If you ever played like a role-playing game or something like that, right? You usually have your little photo up here, and then you've got your stats somewhere on the page, right? Like your intelligence, your wisdom, your charisma, your dexterity, right? If you ever played a game like this, you know what I'm talking about. And so these stats, some of them are higher, right? And some of them are lower. And so, depending on what stats you have, you'll be better at being a certain class or playing a certain role. Like, if your intelligence is very high, you might make a good wizard, right? If your dexterity is very high, you might make a good archer or a ranger, something along those lines, okay? But that doesn't have to limit you. And so I think some people, when they get in too deep into the stereotypes, they say, okay, so what you're telling me is I'm a wizard. No, what MBTI tells you, just like what your dreams tell you and what tarot tells you and stuff like that, is how you're interpreting the world, okay? What patterns exist inside of you and in your life. And they're trying to tell you what options you have available. So the sort of NE, they're telling you like, okay, well, if you're going to move forward with this set of skills, this is probably what you're going to be best at, but it doesn't tell you what you have to do, and it doesn't tell you who you are. It just tells you the patterns that are going to recur based on the patterns that you've developed from your childhood onward. So again, it's all psychological, and MBTI, of course, falls into the category of psychology, even if it's not quite clinical psychology. It's going to tell you or give you some idea of how you can interpret yourself and your identity, right? So if you think about that process of FI interpreting SE into SI, right? It's that process of looking at the external stimuli, the external data set, and saying, how am I going to interpret this into my identity, right? How am I going to interpret this more toward the internal self? So there's a sort of axis of we go internal and then we go external, right? So the right side is internal and then the left side is external. And so it's always flowing around in a circle. So as you go into that circle, you can figure out, okay, well, this is how I relate to the world, right? Like if I'm really smart, but I don't have big muscles, maybe it's less likely that I'll be a successful athlete and more likely that I'll be a successful scientist. But does that mean that you can't be a successful athlete? Athlete? No. Of course, just because you start with a high intelligence doesn't mean that you can't apply that intelligence and say, for example, research how to work out and then increase your strength and your dexterity and then become a successful athlete. Okay, so I don't think that it's healthy or good to look at MBTI and say, this is the box that I'm stuck in, and this is the box that other people are stuck in, and I know everything about them because I know their little, type indicator, right? No, that's not who they are. That's a set of values that they've been working with that have created patterns that they may or may not continue to have throughout their entire life. But because it tends to develop in childhood, we tend to work off that and say, hey, look, rather than rewrite my entire history, why don't I work with what I've got, right? If I'm good at some things and bad at other things, why don't I focus on that and say, how do I become a balanced human being? How do I become successful and learn to love myself and interact in a healthy and balanced way with others using the model that I've got? Okay, so that's why I talk about things like archetypes and I refer it back to kind of a concept of tarot or astrology, because the way I personally use tarot, I have never believed, I shouldn't say never, but I no longer believe that tarot has magical powers where it can tell you the future and, oh, well, if the tarot cards say it, then it must be true. No, how I use tarot is, okay, you've got your deck and then you flip over a card, and the card, let's say it's the Queen of Swords, right? The Queen of Swords has a lot to do with a specific pattern or a specific archetype. And so when you're looking at that and you're reading the description, right, you're reading the description of what a Queen of Swords means, it says something about, oh, well, this person is very powerful and logical and so on and so forth. And so you ask yourself, okay, well, how does this fit into my experience? Okay, how does this fit into my concept of myself and my life and everything that's happening to me right now? And it may help you identify something like a person in your life or an instance, a situation in your life where you feel like this applies, and you can begin to create a narrative, a psychological narrative, a subjective narrative based on your interpretation of the card. But in a lot of ways, it's really just things like tarot and astrology and stuff like that. It's really writing a story almost like color by numbers, right? Where every card you flip over, it's a prompt. It's like saying, do you believe this? Is this relevant to you? And if it's relevant to you, how and why, right? So the Queen of Swords is not going to be relevant to you. You're not going to interpret it in the same way that I would interpret it or that somebody else would interpret it, right? Because everyone's going to have a different experience of it. Everyone's going to take the external stimuli of the Queen of Swords and put it through their FI filter differently because they have a different identity, different past and all that. And they're going to end up with a different imprint, a different stamp of what they believe this means and how they experienced it. And so that's why things like this are valuable, not to predict the future, but to predict yourself, to interpret yourself and say, okay, if I have this dream, for example, dream interpretation I consider very similar. Why did I have that dream? It's not necessarily predicting the future. It's not, oh, well, I had a dream where, I became president, so I'm going to become president. No, not necessarily. Maybe you will, but that's not how I interpret dreams personally. How I interpret dreams is, okay, why were you shown that image? Okay, well, your dreams come from your own subconscious, right? So it's even better than tarot because the tarot is just a random card from a deck, right? I don't personally believe, although it's possible, but I don't personally believe that like spirits or anything like that are choosing your cards for you. It's basically randomly generating a dream. Think of it like that. It's randomly generating a story or a dream for you to interpret. And so, similar to a dream, when you interpret that, you're asking the question, why? Why did I have this dream? Why do I interpret the card the way I do? It's sort of like having a smell, right? If you smell a certain thing, it brings up a certain memory. Why, when I see the Queen of Swords and I read the description of what that card means, why do I instantly think of, my ex-romantic partner? Or something like that. What does that mean? And then you can begin to analyze this in depth. Okay, so this is the same way that I recommend using MBTI. It's archetypal, it's conceptual, it's symbolic, it's pattern based. It's not predicting the future. It's not telling you who you are or who you have to be or who anyone else is. What it's saying is, if you interpret things in a certain way, if you see this pattern in your personality, okay, then this might mean that you're focused on a particular thing. And that might mean that you have a certain order of things that you focus on. And if this is true, which I think often it is, then you can start to learn about your pattern and how to apply that and how to master it and how to become a better version of you. So why do I prefer it over things like ocean, which is probably more statistically accurate? Well, because you can't grow as much from ocean, in my opinion, right? Ocean stands for things like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, right? So how much can I learn from that? Just the fact that I'm extroverted, for example, without going into the depth with all these functions and things like that, just the fact that I'm extroverted. Okay, done. I answered that question on the test. I know that I'm extrovert or I'm an introvert. I'm personally an introvert. So what do I do with that? Well, how much can you really learn just from knowing that your extroversion is 75% or your introversion or your extroversion is 25%? Where do you go from there, right? There's no map, right? We need a map to tell us where to go from there to begin or to continue exploring what this means about us, our identity, how can we get to know ourselves better, right? Yes, this may work in a workplace to predict your job satisfaction, but is that really the most important thing in life? I don't think so. I think it's much more important to be talking about your story, right? Everything, if you go back to my very first video, everything comes back to this concept of a story. All of it is about a story, your own character and your own story. That's what life is. It's a subjective story that you're experiencing from a subjective perspective. So I use and recommend that you use MBTI primarily as a way to understand your character, kind of like the stats on a character sheet, and then interpret how you want to proceed with telling and exploring and expressing your character and your story going into the future. So I know this is a little bit different from our usual videos, but I'm trying to get into anything that I think can help anyone who views these videos understand themselves and their reality and their character and how that character fits into the greater narrative, not only of their own life, but of the universe as a whole and this one divine mind experiencing and re-experiencing itself in the great cycle over and over and over again for eternity. So, hope that helped, and I will see you all next time.